There's a luxury resort nestled at the base of Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado Springs called the Broadmoor. On this particular afternoon, the West Terrace had been transformed into something out of a dream. White roses and peonies draped over every surface, cascading greenery hanging from a marble arch, and 300 chairs arranged in perfect rows, filled with the who's who of Colorado high society. A 12-piece orchestra played softly in the background. Flowers had been flown in from Ecuador. The budget for this wedding, north of $400,000. The groom stood near the entrance in a tailored black tuxedo, his sandy blonde hair swept to the side, pale blue eyes gleaming with that confident old-money smile. Beside him, his bride-to-be glowed in a Vera Wang gown, blonde hair pinned in an elegant updo. They looked like a magazine cover. Perfect, polished, untouchable, 300 guests, Bentleys and Mercedes lined up at valet, politicians, business owners, families whose money was older than the state itself. Everything was flawless. And then, 15 minutes before the ceremony was set to begin, a black Escalade with tinted windows pulled up to the grand entrance. The murmur started small. Then it spread like wildfire. The door opened, and out stepped a woman in a deep emerald green gown that caught the Colorado sunlight like it was made of liquid jewels. Her natural hair was styled in an elegant updo adorned with gold accessories. Diamond earrings flickered with every movement. She was stunning, the kind of stunning that makes an entire room forget what they were doing. And then the other door opened. A 12-year-old boy stepped out, tall for his age, light brown skin, a head full of curly hair, and his eyes, pale blue, ice blue. The exact same eyes as the groom standing 50 feet away. The groom's face drained of every ounce of color. His confident smile vanished. His jaw went slack. Because that boy, that 12-year-old boy, looked exactly like him. The same jawline, the same nose, the same unmistakable Whitfield eyes staring right back at him. The crowd went dead silent. Now, let me rewind. Because before this moment, before the Escalade, before the emerald gown, before a 12-year-old boy stood face to face with the father who never wanted him, there was a handwritten note on the back of a wedding invitation. It read, "Thought my poor desperate ex should see what she missed out on." See. The woman who received that note didn't cry. She didn't crumble. She didn't call anyone in a panic. She read it 3 times, looked up at the big Colorado sky, and she smiled. Not a sad smile, not a bitter smile. A smile that said, "Oh, sweetheart, you have absolutely no idea what's coming." Her name was Nicole Carter. And this is her story. What would you do if the man who threw you away, who looked you dead in the eye and told you he couldn't build a future with someone who has nothing, sent you a wedding invitation just to rub your success in your face? What would you do if he scribbled a note calling you his poor desperate ex, expecting you to sit at home and cry into your pillow? But here's the twist. He had no idea that the woman he discarded was now a millionaire CEO. He didn't know she'd been featured in Forbes. He didn't know she'd spoken at TED. He didn't know she'd had dinner at the White House. He didn't know she had access to a private jet. And he definitely didn't know that the son he told her to get rid of, the baby he wanted erased, was now the youngest tech founder in Colorado history, running a company valued at $500 million. He knew none of it. Not a single thing. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated? Has someone ever looked at you and seen nothing? Not your heart, not your hustle, not the fire burning behind your eyes, just what you didn't have, just what you couldn't offer them? If you know that feeling, then this story was made for you. Because today I'm telling you the story of a woman who was told she had nothing and built everything. A woman who raised a genius on her own. A woman who turned heartbreak into a $500 million empire. A woman who showed up to her ex's wedding, not for revenge, but for truth. But what happened when she walked through those doors? What did the groom do when he saw his own blue eyes staring back at him from a 12-year-old boy's face? What did the bride do when she realized the man she was about to marry had been hiding a son for over a decade? Stay with me, because by the end of this story, your jaw will be on the floor. But before we get into this story, I need your help with something. If you're the kind of person who loves stories that move you, stories that make you feel something real, I need you to do me a favor right now. Smash that like button. I'm serious. Hit it right now because it helps YouTube push this video out to more people who need to hear it. and drop a comment below telling me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to love you? I want to hear your story, and if you're new here, welcome to Mr. John Stories. This is the place where we tell stories that don't just entertain, they transform. We share real, powerful narratives about life, love, resilience, and the kind of comebacks that only God can write. So if that sounds like something you need in your life, hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss a single story. Now, for my returning viewers, my day ones, y'all already know how we do it over here. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being part of this family. I see every single one of you and I appreciate you more than you know. All right, enough talking, let's get into it. To understand what happened at that wedding, to truly understand the weight of that moment, we need to go back. Back to Denver, Colorado. Back to the year 2012. Back to where it all began. Denver, Colorado in 2012 was a city that felt like it was waking up. The whole place had this energy to it. This crisp, mountain-charged electricity that hummed through the streets and made you believe that anything was possible. Downtown was booming. New restaurants were opening every other week. Tech startups were popping up in every corner of Loudoun like wildflowers after a spring rain. Young professionals flooded the city, chasing the American dream with lattes in one hand and laptops in the other. The Rocky Mountains stood tall in the background like a promise, reminding everyone that greatness was always within reach if you were willing to climb. And somewhere in the northeast part of that city, in a neighborhood called Park Hill, there lived a young woman who was already climbing. Her name was Nicole Denise Carter. She was 26 years old. She stood 5'6" with deep brown skin that glowed like she'd been kissed by the Colorado sun itself. She had thick, natural hair that she wore in twists most days, sometimes pulled up in a wrap when she was working, which was almost always. Her eyes were dark brown, so dark they were almost black, and when she smiled, which was often, her whole face lit up like a sunrise breaking over the Rocky Mountains. Nicole had the kind of beauty that didn't need makeup or designer clothes to announce itself. It just was. Effortless. Undeniable. The kind of beauty that came from the inside and worked its way out. But beauty wasn't what defined Nicole Carter. Not even close. If you know Denver, you know Park Hill. It's a historically black neighborhood in the northeast part of the city, and it's the kind of place that raises you whether your parents are around or not. Everybody knew everybody. Miss Ruthie down the street would watch you through her window and call your mama if she saw you acting up. The smell of barbecue on a Saturday afternoon could pull you out of a dead sleep and have you standing on someone's porch with a paper plate before you even realized you'd left the house. The church on the corner wasn't just a building. It was the heartbeat of the entire community. Park Hill didn't just give you a zip code. It gave you roots. It gave you backbone. It gave you the kind of toughness that no Ivy League school could teach. And the woman who gave Nicole the deepest roots of all was her grandmother, Nana May. Nana May was a fortress. There's no other word for it. She stood barely 5'2", but she carried herself like she was 7 feet tall. She worked 2 jobs, one at a dry cleaner on Colfax Avenue pressing other people's clothes until her hands ached, and another doing overnight shifts at a nursing home in Aurora, caring for other people's grandparents while raising her own grandchild. She never complained. Not once. She'd come home at 6 in the morning after a 12-hour shift, kick off her shoes, tie on her apron, and start making breakfast for Nicole like she'd had a full night's sleep. Nana May raised Nicole on 3 things: Scripture, sweet potato pie, and a philosophy that she repeated so often, it became the soundtrack of Nicole's childhood. Baby, the world ain't gonna hand you nothing, but God gave you a brain and 2 hands. That's all you need. Nicole needed those words. She needed them because life had already taken so much from her before she was old enough to understand why. Her mother passed away when Nicole was just 7 years old. A car accident on I-70 during a snowstorm. One of those Colorado winter tragedies that makes the evening news for 30 seconds and then gets forgotten by everyone except the family left behind. Nicole didn't forget. She carried her mother's memory in a locket around her neck and in a quiet place inside her heart that she didn't let many people visit. Her father? Well, Nana May had a way of describing him that was both generous and devastating at the same time. She called him a man with good intentions and no follow-through. He drifted in and out of Nicole's life like Colorado weather, unpredictable, unreliable, and never quite what you needed when you needed it. A birthday card here, a phone call there, promises that evaporated like morning dew on a July sidewalk. Eventually, Nicole stopped expecting him to show up, and that, in its own painful way, was a lesson too. But here's what you need to understand about Nicole. Losing her mother and being let down by her father didn't break her. It built her. It lit a fire inside her that nothing and nobody could put out. Nicole was brilliant. Not just smart. Brilliant. The kind of girl who won the science fair 3 years in a row at her public school and still had time to braid her best friend's hair on the weekend. The kind of student who teachers talked about in the break room, shaking their heads in amazement. She graduated top of her class at Montbello High School. Not top 10. Not top 5. Top of her class. And she earned a full scholarship to the University of Denver. Full ride. Every penny covered. Not because someone pulled strings, not because a donor wrote a check, because Nicole Carter earned it with her mind. She studied computer science, and I need you to sit with this for a moment. In her entire program, out of 200 students, there were only 4 black women. 4 out of 200. Let that sink in. She walked into lecture halls where nobody looked like her. She sat in study groups where she was the only one who'd ever had to worry about whether the electricity would stay on at home. She listened to classmates complain about their parents cutting their allowance, while she was working 2 part-time jobs just to cover her textbooks. She didn't complain. She didn't shrink. She didn't ask for sympathy or special treatment. She showed up every single day, sat in the front row, raised her hand, and outperformed students whose parents were paying $50,000 a year in tuition. Nicole Denise Carter was not the kind of woman who waited for permission to be great. She never had that luxury, and she didn't need it. Now, there are some people in this world who measure love by what's sitting in your bank account. They don't see your heart. They don't see your hustle. They don't see the fire burning behind your eyes. All they see is what you don't have. All they calculate is what you can't bring to the table. And if the numbers don't add up, neither do you. To them, love isn't a feeling. It's a transaction. It's a balance sheet. It's 2 portfolios merging. And anyone who can't contribute assets, well, they simply aren't worth the time. Colson Reed Whitfield was exactly that kind of man. Colson was 32 years old in 2012. Tall, 6'2", with sandy blonde hair that he kept swept to the side like he'd just stepped off a yacht. His eyes were pale blue, so pale they almost looked silver in the right light. He had that look, you know the one, the kind of man who grew up knowing he was handsome and made sure the rest of the world never forgot it. Everything about Colson was polished. His smile, his posture, the way he walked into a room like he owned it and everyone in it. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes not from achievement but from inheritance. Because Colson Whitfield had never earned a single thing in his life. He came from old Colorado money, the kind of money that doesn't need to introduce itself because everyone already knows its name. His father, Garrison Whitfield, owned a chain of luxury car dealerships spread across the entire Front Range. We're talking Mercedes, BMW, Porsche, the kind of showrooms where the floors are so clean you could eat off them and the salesmen wear suits that cost more than most people's rent. Garrison was a big man with a bigger ego, the patriarch of the Whitfield family who believed that wealth wasn't just something you had, it was something you were. And then there was Colson's mother, Prudence Whitfield. Prudence was the type of woman who hosted charity galas not because she cared about charity, but because she cared about being seen caring about charity. She sat on boards she never attended. She donated to causes she couldn't name. And she curated her social circle the way a museum curator selects paintings. Only the finest, only the most valuable, and absolutely nothing that clashed with the aesthetic. The Whitfields lived in Cherry Creek, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Denver, in a house so big it had a name. Whitfield Manor. Yes, they named their house. They actually gave their house a name like it was a country estate in the English countryside. That single detail tells you everything you need to know about this family. Colson grew up inside that bubble. Private schools from kindergarten through 12th grade. A brand new BMW waiting in the driveway on his 16th birthday with a bow on it. a degree from the University of Colorado Boulder that his father's generous donation to the alumni fund practically guaranteed. He never struggled. He never wondered where his next meal was coming from. He never lay awake at night worrying about electricity bills or tuition payments. The world had been handed to Colson Whitfield on a silver platter, and he'd grown so used to the taste of silver that he thought it was normal. After college, Colson went to work at the family dealership. Not because he had to, not because he'd applied and interviewed and competed for the position like everyone else. He walked in because his last name was on the building. They gave him the title of Vice President of Operations, and Colson loved that title the way a child loves a shiny toy. He had business cards printed, thick, cream-colored cards with embossed gold lettering, and he handed them out at bars and cocktail parties like he was distributing golden tickets to a world most people could only dream of entering. But here's the thing about Colson, and I need you to listen closely because this is important. He wasn't a bad man in the way you might expect. He wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty. He didn't wake up in the morning plotting ways to hurt people. He was something almost worse than that. He was a man who had been taught, from the cradle to adulthood, that your worth as a human being was determined by your net worth. That love was not something you felt. It was something you negotiated. That a relationship wasn't a partnership of hearts. It was a merger of assets. And anyone who couldn't bring something to the table that looked good on paper, they simply weren't worth his time. That was the man Colson Whitfield was in 2012. Polished on the outside, hollow on the inside, rich in every way that didn't matter and poor in every way that did. Now, it was a Friday night in October 2012. One of those perfect Denver autumn evenings where the air is cool but not cold, and the leaves along Spear Boulevard are turning gold and red like the whole city is catching fire in slow motion. Nicole was working her part-time job as a bartender at a trendy cocktail spot in Reno, the River North Art District. The place was called Ember, and it was one of those bars where the drinks had names you couldn't pronounce and cost more than Nicole made in an hour. She was behind the bar, shaking a cocktail with the kind of effortless cool that made people stop mid-conversation and watch when Colson walked in with a group of his buddies. They were loud. They were confident. They smelled like expensive cologne and entitlement. They took over a section of the bar like they'd reserved it with their presence alone. Colson sat down directly across from Nicole, looked at her with those pale blue eyes, and said, and I quote, "You're way too pretty to be making drinks." Now, most women might have blushed. Some might have rolled their eyes and moved on. But Nicole set the cocktail shaker down, looked him dead in those silver blue eyes without blinking, and said, "And you're way too old to be using pickup lines that bad." His friends erupted. The whole group lost it, hollering, slapping the bar. One of them nearly fell off his stool. Colson's face went red from his collar to his hairline. But then, and this is the part that got him, Nicole smiled. That smile, that warm, radiant, completely disarming smile that could stop traffic on a 6-lane highway. And Colson Whitfield, for the first time in his carefully curated life, was completely and utterly caught off guard. He didn't leave. He stayed at that bar until closing time, nursing the same whiskey sour for 3 hours straight just to keep the conversation going. Nicole told him about her computer science degree, about her dream of building technology that could help underserved communities, about growing up in Park Hill, about Nana May. And Colson, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, told her things he'd never told anyone. He told her about feeling like he was living someone else's life, about the weight of his father's expectations, about the emptiness that sat in his chest no matter how many business cards he handed out, or how many zeros were in his bank account. For the first time in his life, Colson felt like someone was seeing him. Not his last name, not his father's money, not the BMW parked outside, just him. And for Nicole, she saw something in Colson that night, a tiny, flickering flame of the man he could have been if the world hadn't taught him to measure everything in dollars and cents. She should have known that a flicker isn't a fire. But she was 26, and 26-year-olds believe in flickers. They started dating after that night at Ember. Quietly at first. Almost carefully. Like two people tiptoeing around something they both knew was bigger than either of them expected. It started with coffee dates at little spots tucked away in Capitol Hill. Then walks around Sloan's Lake at sunset, where the water reflected the mountains, and the sky turned shades of pink and orange that made Denver look like a painting. Then came the late-night phone calls, the kind that start at 10 and don't end until 2, 3 in the morning, where you're lying in bed with the phone pressed to your ear, and your voice gets softer and softer, until you're whispering secrets you've never told anyone. Coulson would show up at Ember just before closing time with takeout from Nicole's favorite Ethiopian restaurant on East Colfax. They'd sit in his car in the parking lot, eating injera with their hands, sauce dripping down their fingers, laughing about nothing and everything while the Denver night wrapped around them like a blanket. Those moments, messy, unscripted, real, were the moments Nicole fell in love. And she did fall in love, deeply, completely. The kind of love that rewires your entire chest and makes you think about someone the second you open your eyes in the morning. She loved the way Coulson laughed when he was genuinely surprised, not that polished, practiced chuckle he used at cocktail parties, but the real one. The one that came from his belly and made his pale blue eyes crinkle at the corners. She loved how he'd get quiet when she talked about Nana May, really quiet, like he was trying to understand a kind of love he'd never experienced in his own home. She loved the man she could see underneath all that polish and privilege, the one who admitted he felt empty, the one who stayed at a bar for 3 hours just to hear her talk, the one who looked at her like she was the most fascinating person he'd ever met. Nicole loved the real Coulson. The problem was, the real Coulson only existed behind closed doors, because here's what was happening on the other side of this relationship. Coulson loved Nicole the way a man loves a secret. He loved her in private, in the dark, in whispered phone calls and parked cars and her tiny apartment in 5 Points where nobody from his world would ever see him. He never introduced her to his family, not once, in 8 months of dating. 8 months of coffee and sunsets and late-night calls and Ethiopian food and laughter and everything that's supposed to mean something. Nicole never set foot inside Whitfield Manor. She never met Garrison. She never met Prudence. She never sat at their dinner table, or attended one of their galas, or was introduced as Coulson's girlfriend at a single-family event. When his friends asked who he was seeing, Coulson would shrug, casual, dismissive, like it was nothing, and say 2 words that cut deeper than any knife: nobody serious. Nobody serious. 8 months. And she was nobody serious. Nicole felt it. She wasn't naive. She felt the walls he threw up every time she mentioned meeting his parents. She felt the way his body would tense if they ran into someone he knew while they were out together. She felt the invisible line he'd drawn between his world and hers, the one that said, loud and clear, without him ever having to speak the words, "You're good enough for my bed, but not good enough for my world." But she loved him, and love, when you're 26 and hopeful and raised by a grandmother who taught you to see the best in people, love makes you patient. Love makes you wait. Love makes you believe that one day he'll come around. That one day he'll choose you out loud instead of in whispers. He didn't. It was June 2013 when Nicole found out she was pregnant. She was sitting on the floor of her tiny apartment in 5 Points, staring at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test, and she felt everything at once. Terror, joy, confusion, hope, all of it crashing into her like waves she couldn't outrun. She called Coulson immediately. He came over that night. Nicole opened the door with tears in her eyes and a trembling smile on her face. She held up the test and whispered, "We're going to be parents." The look on Coulson's face. I wish I could tell you he smiled. I wish I could tell you he pulled her close and told her everything was going to be okay. But he didn't. His face went white. Whiter than usual. He sat down on her second-hand couch, put his head in his hands, and said nothing for a full 3 minutes. The silence in that apartment was suffocating. Then he looked up and said 5 words that shattered everything. "You can't keep this baby." Nicole felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her feet. "What? Nicole, be realistic. My family, my parents, they would never accept this. You know that. We're not in a position for this." "Not in a position?" Nicole's voice was shaking now. "Coulson, I'm carrying your child. And nobody can know that." He stood up. He was pacing now, running his hands through that sandy blonde hair. "Look, I'll pay for whatever you need, but this can't happen. Not now. Not like this. Not like what, Coulson? Not like what? Say it. He stopped pacing. He turned and looked at her. And in that look, in those pale blue eyes she had loved for 8 months, Nicole saw everything he'd been hiding, every canceled dinner when his parents were in town, every time he'd asked her to park around the corner, every nobody serious. It was all right there, written across his face like a confession he didn't have the courage to speak. But he spoke it anyway. I can't build a future with someone who has nothing, Nicole. I'm sorry. I can't. Someone who has nothing. Nicole stood there in her apartment. The apartment she paid for with her own money, working 2 jobs while finishing her degree. The apartment decorated with photos of Nana May, with books stacked on every surface, with a vision board on the wall covered in dreams she fully intended to make real. And this man who had never earned a single thing in his entire life, looked at her and saw nothing. She didn't cry, not in front of him. She would not give him that. She walked to her front door, opened it wide, and said 2 words. Get out. Nicole. Get out. He left, and just like that, 8 months of love, or whatever Coulson had been pretending was love, vanished like morning fog lifting off the Platte River. Nicole kept the baby. Of course she did. Nana May didn't raise a woman who ran from hard things. She told her grandmother everything. The relationship, the pregnancy, the rejection, every ugly word. Nana May listened quietly, holding Nicole's hands in her own weathered palms. Then she looked her granddaughter in the eye and said, Baby, that man showed you who he is. Believe him. Now let's focus on who you're about to become. The pregnancy was hard. Nicole was sick for the first 4 months. The kind of sick that keeps you on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m, wondering how your body can feel this broken and still be creating something so beautiful. She kept working. She kept finishing freelance coding projects. She kept saving every penny she could, tucking money away like she was building a wall between her child and the world that had already tried to reject him. Coulson sent a check for $5,000 with a note that said, For expenses. Please don't contact my family. Nicole looked at that check for a long time. Then she tore it in half, slid both pieces back into the envelope, and mailed it right back to him. She didn't need his money. She didn't need his guilt. And she certainly didn't need his conditions. On February 14th, 2014, Valentine's Day, of all days, Nicole gave birth to a baby boy at Denver Health Medical Center. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, light brown skin, a head full of curly hair so soft it felt like cotton, and his eyes, pale blue eyes, Coulson's eyes, those unmistakable Whitfield eyes looking up at her from the tiniest, most perfect face she had ever seen. She named him Archie. Archie Denise Carter. She gave him her last name and her grandmother's middle name. Not Whitfield Carter. He was hers. Completely, entirely, unapologetically hers. Coulson never came to the hospital. He never called to ask if the baby was a boy or a girl. He never sent flowers or a card or even a text message. He simply moved on. Like Nicole and Archie were a chapter in a book he'd decided to stop reading. Like they were an inconvenience he'd successfully filed away. But here's what Coulson didn't understand, and what men like him never understand. You can throw a woman away. You can discard her. You can look her in the eye and tell her she has nothing. But you cannot throw away her purpose. And Nicole Carter had just found hers. She was holding him in her arms. He weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces. He had his father's eyes, but his mother's fire. And that fire was about to burn brighter than anything Coulson Whitfield could ever imagine. The first 2 years of Archie's life were the hardest 2 years Nicole had ever lived. And that's saying something, because this was a woman who had already buried her mother, been abandoned by her father, and had the man she loved look her in the eye and tell her she was nothing. But nothing prepared her for the weight of single motherhood. Nana May was there, of course. She was always there. But Nana May was 74 years old now, and the years were starting to show in ways they hadn't before. Her hands, those strong, steady hands that had pressed other people's clothes for decades and held Nicole through every storm, were starting to shake. Her knees ached when she climbed the stairs. She still worked her shift at the dry cleaner, but she'd cut back her hours at the nursing home, because her body simply wouldn't let her do what her spirit still wanted to. Nana May was still a fortress, but even fortresses show cracks when enough time passes. So Nicole carried the weight. Most of it, nearly all of it. She did freelance web development during Archie's nap times. And if you've ever been around a baby, you know that nap times are not generous. You get 45 minutes if you're lucky. Maybe an hour if God is smiling down on you. Nicole would put Archie down in his crib, tiptoe to the kitchen table where her laptop was already open, and code like her life depended on it. Because it did. She'd type with one hand and hold a bottle in the other when he woke up early. She'd debug software while singing lullabies, her fingers flying across the keyboard while her voice hummed, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," in a rhythm that somehow kept both the baby calm and the code clean. She wrote project proposals at 2 a.m, not because she wanted to, because that was the only time the apartment was quiet enough to think. Archie would finally be asleep. Nana May would be resting in the next room, and Nicole would sit at that kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and type until her eyes burned. She pitched herself to small businesses, to nonprofits, to anyone who needed a website built or a database designed. Most of them never responded. Some of them told her they'd found someone cheaper. A few of them hired her, paid her late, and then asked for revisions they didn't want to pay for. But she kept going. Every single time she kept going. There were nights, and I need you to hear this, because this is the part of the story that doesn't make it into the Forbes articles or the TED Talks. There were nights when Nicole sat on her kitchen floor and cried. Not the pretty kind of crying you see in movies, the ugly kind, the kind where your whole body shakes and your face is pressed against the cold linoleum, and you're trying to be quiet because you don't want to wake the baby or worry your 74-year-old grandmother sleeping in the next room. She cried because the electricity bill was 3 months behind, and the disconnect notice was sitting on the counter like a threat she couldn't outrun. She cried because Archie had an ear infection, and the antibiotics cost $87 she didn't have. So she put it on a credit card that was already maxed out and prayed she'd figure it out later. She cried because the late payment notices were piling up like snow in a Denver winter, relentless, suffocating, and impossible to ignore. She cried because she was tired, bone-deep, soul-deep tired, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix because it lives in a place that rest can't reach. But here's the thing about Nicole Carter, and this is the part I need you to carry with you for the rest of this story. Every single morning, no matter what happened the night before, no matter how many tears had soaked into that kitchen floor, she got up. She got up, she washed her face, she tied her hair back, and she walked into Archie's room. And the moment that little boy looked up at her from his crib with those pale blue eyes and smiled, every ounce of pain, every tear, every late notice, every sleepless night, it all became fuel. She didn't get up for herself. She got up for him. She got up for Nana May, who had sacrificed everything so that Nicole could have a chance. She got up because somewhere deep inside her, in that place where purpose lives and doubt can't reach, she knew this wasn't the end of her story. This was the middle. The hard, ugly, beautiful middle. And the middle is where champions are made. Nicole Carter was not going to stay on that kitchen floor. She was going to build something from it. And if you know what that feels like, if you know what it's like to keep going when everything around you is screaming stop, then drop A in the comments right now. I'm serious. Let me see that strength. And if this story is hitting home, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Send them this video, because somebody out there is sitting on their own kitchen floor right now, and they need to know that the floor is not the end. It's the foundation. By 2016, Nicole had saved enough money to do something she'd been dreaming about since those 2 a.m. kitchen table sessions. She started her own company. She called it Carter Digital Solutions. And when I say she started a company, I don't mean she had investors lining up or a fancy office with glass walls and espresso machines. I mean, it was one woman, one laptop, and a 2-year-old baby on her hip. That was the entire operation. Her office was her kitchen table. Her conference room was the living room couch. Her business partner was a toddler who liked to bang on the keyboard when she wasn't looking. Carter Digital Solutions didn't launch with a press release or a launch party. It launched with a mother who was tired of building other people's dreams for pennies and decided it was time to build her own. Her first client was a nonprofit in Montbello. her old neighborhood. They needed a website and a donor database, and they needed it fast because their funding cycle was closing in 3 weeks. Most firms would have charged them $15,000, $20,000 and taken 2 months to deliver. Nicole charged them a fraction of that and delivered the entire project. Website, database, donor portal, everything, in 3 weeks flat. She coded during nap times. She designed layouts after bedtime. She tested the site on her phone while feeding Archie breakfast. And when she handed over the finished product, the director of that non-profit looked at her and said, "How did you do all of this by yourself?" Nicole smiled and said, "I didn't. My son helped." That non-profit told another non-profit. That non-profit told a small business owner. That small business owner told 2 more. And just like that, referral by referral, project by project, handshake by handshake, Carter Digital Solutions started to grow. Nicole's pricing philosophy was simple, and it came from a place most business schools don't teach: empathy. She charged half of what the big firms charged, not because she didn't know her worth. She knew it better than anyone, but because she remembered what it felt like to be overlooked. She remembered what it felt like to be the small person in the room, the one without the budget, the one the big companies wouldn't even return a phone call to. She built her business for the people who reminded her of herself, the hustlers, the dreamers, the ones who had more vision than capital, and they loved her for it. The referrals kept coming. Non-profits turned into small businesses. Small businesses turned into bigger businesses. A restaurant chain in Aurora needed a full digital overhaul. A real estate group in Lakewood wanted a custom client portal. A healthcare startup in Boulder needed an entire platform built from scratch. Nicole took on every project she could handle and delivered every single one on time, on budget, and above expectations. By 2018, Carter Digital Solutions had 5 employees. 5. That might not sound like a lot, but for a woman who started with nothing but a laptop and a baby on her hip, 5 employees felt like an army. Nicole rented a co-working space in Reno, the River North Art District, the same neighborhood where she used to bartend at Ember just a few years earlier. The co-working space was 3 blocks from Ember. 3 blocks. And some afternoons, when the weather was nice and Archie was in preschool, Nicole would take a walk during her lunch break. She'd push past the coffee shops and the art galleries and the new restaurants that had popped up since the neighborhood started booming, and she'd walk right past Ember. She'd stop for a moment, look at the front door, and remember the girl she used to be. The bartender shaking cocktails, the 26-year-old who fell in love with a man who measured her worth in dollar signs. She didn't feel bitterness when she stood there. That's what people always get wrong about stories like this. They expect the woman to be angry. They expect her to want revenge. But Nicole didn't feel any of that. What she felt, standing 3 blocks from the place where Colson Whitfield had walked into her life and turned it upside down, was gratitude. Not gratitude for him. Never that. Gratitude for the path. Gratitude for the heartbreak that forced her off the kitchen floor and into her destiny. Gratitude for the rejection that lit a fire so hot it forged an entire company. If Colson had stayed, if he'd been the man she needed him to be, Nicole might have spent her life being a supportive girlfriend to a man who inherited everything and earned nothing. Instead, she became the woman who built everything from nothing. The heartbreak led her here. And here was just the beginning. Because while Nicole was building Carter Digital Solutions, something extraordinary was happening right under her roof. Something she hadn't planned for. Something no business model or 5-year projection could have predicted. Her son, that little boy with the curly hair and the pale blue eyes, was turning out to be a genius. Nicole first noticed it when Archie was 3 years old. She came home from a client meeting one afternoon and found him sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with a picture book open in his lap. Nothing unusual about that. Except he wasn't just looking at the pictures. He was reading the words. Out loud. Slowly, carefully, his tiny finger tracing each letter like he was having a private conversation with the page. He looked up at her and said, "Mama, this book says the caterpillar ate through 5 oranges." He was 3. Nicole stood in the doorway with her keys still in her hand and her mouth hanging open. Nana May, sitting in her recliner across the room, just shook her head and smiled. "That boy got something special in him, baby. I've been telling you." By 5, Archie was taking apart electronics, not breaking them. taking them apart. With purpose. With curiosity. Nicole came home one evening to find her alarm clock in 47 pieces on the kitchen table, each component laid out in a neat row like a surgeon's instruments. Before she could say a word, Archie looked up at her and said, "I wanted to see how it knows what time it is." Then he put the entire thing back together. It worked perfectly. By 7, he was writing code. Nicole had left her laptop open one Saturday morning while she was making breakfast, and Archie climbed into the chair, opened a text editor, and started typing. When Nicole walked over with a plate of scrambled eggs, she looked at the screen and nearly dropped it. He had written a simple program, basic, messy, full of errors a professional would laugh at, but it worked. When he hit enter, the screen displayed 2 words. "Hello, Archie." He looked up at his mother with those pale blue eyes wide as saucers and said, "Mama, I made the computer say hello to me." Nicole set the plate down, knelt beside him, wrapped her arms around his small frame and held him so tight he squirmed. She whispered into his curly hair, "Baby, you are going to change the world." She had no idea how right she was. When Archie was 10 years old, Nicole took him volunteering at a homeless shelter on Park Avenue West in Denver. It was something she'd been doing for years, giving back to the community that had held her up when she had nothing. Archie had been coming along since he was old enough to carry a tray. He'd serve meals, help sort donated clothes, talk to people with a warmth and ease that stunned the adults around him. He didn't see homeless individuals as statistics or problems. He saw them as people, real people with real stories who just needed someone to see them. One cold evening after their shift, Archie was quiet in the car. Nicole glanced over at him in the rearview mirror. He was staring out the window, his brow furrowed the way it always did when his mind was working on something big. "Mama," he said, "why don't they just use their phones to find a bed? Like, why isn't there an app that tells them where the open beds are, or where they can get food, or who can help them?" Nicole looked at him through the mirror. "That's a really good question, baby." Archie was quiet for another moment. Then he said, and these are the words that changed everything, "Then I'll build one. I'll connect them." And he did. At 10 years old, Archie Denise Carter built an app called HomeLink. It was a platform that connected homeless individuals with available shelter beds, food banks, mental health services, and social workers, all in real time, all from a smartphone. The interface was simple enough for anyone to use. The back end was sophisticated enough to make grown engineers scratch their heads in disbelief. A 10-year-old built this. A 10-year-old who learned to code on his mother's laptop while she was making scrambled eggs. HomeLink went viral. First, it was the local Denver news stations picking up the story, a 5th grader who built an app to help the homeless. Then, national outlets caught wind of it. Tech blogs wrote about it. Social media exploded with it. And then the phone started ringing. Venture capitalists, angel investors, tech executives, all of them wanting a piece of what this kid had created. Nicole watched it all happening, and she did what she had always done. She protected her son. She didn't let the visa swarm him. She didn't let the media turn him into a circus act. She sat down, called the best lawyers and business advisors she could find, and formed a company. Archie Technologies, Inc. Nicole became the CEO. Archie became the Chief Innovation Officer. She built a wall of protection around her son's genius so that the world could benefit from it without consuming him. And the world did benefit. By 2025, HomeLink was operating in over 300 cities across the United States. But Archie didn't stop there. He developed 2 more applications, one that connected foster youth with mentors and resources, and another that helped families find affordable housing in their communities. 3 apps. 3 problems that grown adults with billions of dollars in funding had failed to solve. And a kid from Park Hill, Denver, built the solutions on his mother's kitchen table. Archie Technologies, Inc. grew to 200 employees, operating out of a sleek office in the Denver Tech Center. The company's valuation hit $500 million. $500 million? Let that number sit with you for a moment. A company founded by a boy who was told before he was even born that he shouldn't exist, valued at $500 million. And Nicole? The woman Colson Whitfield said had nothing. She was featured in Forbes magazine. She delivered a TED Talk that garnered over 10 million views. She attended a dinner at the White House. She drove a Range Rover through the same Denver streets where she used to push a stroller with holes in her shoes. She bought a beautiful home in Washington Park, one of the nicest neighborhoods in the city, and she had access to a private jet whenever business required it. Archie, at 12 years old, was the youngest tech founder in Colorado history. His face had been on magazine covers. His story had been told on stages across the country, and his pale blue eyes, those Whitfield eyes, looked out at the world not with entitlement or arrogance, but with the same warmth and purpose his mother had poured into him since the day he was born. And Coulson? Coulson Reed Whitfield, the man who told Nicole to get rid of this boy, the man who said he couldn't build a future with someone who had nothing, had absolutely no idea any of this had happened. He never Googled Nicole's name. He never searched for his son. He never once, in over a decade, typed Nicole Carter or Archie Carter into a search bar. He had erased them from his life so completely that he didn't even know what he'd thrown away. He had no idea that the woman he called his poor desperate ex was now a millionaire CEO. He had no idea that the baby he wanted erased was now a $500 million tech prodigy. He had no idea that the life he rejected had become the life most people only dream about. But he was about to find out. Now, while Nicole was building an empire and raising a genius, what was Coulson Reed Whitfield doing with his life? The answer is simple. And it's sad. Nothing. He was doing absolutely nothing. After he walked out of Nicole's apartment that night in June 2013, after he told the woman carrying his child that he couldn't build a future with someone who had nothing, Coulson went right back to the bubble he'd been living in his entire life. He drove his BMW back to Cherry Creek, walked through the front door of Whitfield Manor, and slipped back into the life that had been waiting for him like a suit that was perfectly tailored, but never quite fit. He went back to the dealership, back to the title of Vice President of Operations that his father had handed him like a participation trophy, back to the Monday morning meetings where he sat at the head of a table he hadn't earned, nodding along to sales reports he barely understood, signing off on decisions that other people had already made for him. Coulson showed up every day in a pressed suit with his name embroidered on the parking spot outside, and he played the role of a man who mattered. But the truth that sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow, was that without his last name, Coulson Whitfield was nobody. And somewhere deep down in a place he refused to visit, he knew it. The years passed, and Coulson filled them the way men like him always do, with women. There was the real estate heiress from Greenwood Village. She was beautiful, polished, came from the right family, and checked every box on the Whitfield checklist. They lasted 6 months. She told him he was emotionally unavailable. He told her she was being dramatic. Then there was the pharmaceutical rep from Denver. Smart, ambitious, well-connected. They dated for a full year. She wanted commitment. She wanted depth. She wanted to know what was going on behind those pale blue eyes that always seemed to be looking at something, or someone that wasn't there. He couldn't give her an answer. She left. Then came the yoga instructor from Aspen. That one lasted exactly 1 ski season. They looked incredible together in photos, the kind of couple that gets double-tapped on social media without a second thought. But when the snow melted, so did whatever they had. She told him he was the loneliest person she'd ever met. He laughed it off and booked a trip to Scottsdale. None of them made him feel the way Nicole had. Not one. And that was the part Coulson would never admit. Not to his friends, not to his family, and certainly not to himself. Because admitting that would mean admitting he'd made the biggest mistake of his life on a June night, in a 5 Points apartment, when he looked at the only woman who ever truly saw him and told her she had nothing. But Coulson didn't deal in feelings. He dealt in appearances, and as long as the outside looked right, the inside didn't matter. By the time he turned 42, his mother Prudence was relentless. She wanted grandchildren. She wanted legacy. She wanted to know why her son, handsome, wealthy, from one of the most prominent families in Denver, was still unmarried. She brought it up at every dinner, every holiday, every charity gala she dragged him to. "Coulson, you're not getting any younger. The Whitfield name needs to continue." So Coulson did what Coulson always did. He found someone who looked right on paper. Her name was Felicity Ann Hargrove. She was 36 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, and she came from a family that owned a chain of boutique hotels across the western slope. She was pleasant. She was polished. She was everything Prudence Whitfield had ever wanted in a daughter-in-law. Felicity smiled at the right times, laughed at the right jokes, and never once made Garrison or Prudence uncomfortable at the dinner table. Coulson proposed after 11 months of dating, not because his heart was full, not because he couldn't imagine life without her, but because it was time, because his mother said so, because the Whitfield name needed an heir and Felicity was the most convenient path to that outcome. Now, and I need you to hear this clearly, Felicity was not the villain of this story. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't scheming. She was a woman who genuinely believed she was marrying a man who loved her. She had no idea about Nicole. She had no idea about the 5 Points apartment, or the pregnancy, or the $5,000 check, or the 2 words that ended everything. And she certainly had no idea that somewhere in Denver, there was a 12-year-old boy with her fiancé's exact eyes who had never met his father. Felicity didn't know about any of it. And that made what was coming even worse. The wedding was planned for a Saturday at the Broadmoor Resort in Colorado Springs, the West Terrace for the ceremony, the main ballroom for the reception, 300 guests, a 12-piece orchestra, flowers flown in from Ecuador, white roses, peonies, cascading greenery. The budget exceeded $400,000. It was going to be the social event of the season, a Whitfield wedding, dripping in old money and new excess. And it was Coulson's idea, his alone, without telling a single soul, to invite Nicole. Why? Pride. Pure, reckless, stupid pride. He'd heard through a mutual acquaintance that Nicole was doing okay for herself. That's all he knew. Doing okay. He assumed she'd started some little freelance business. Maybe she was making decent money. Maybe she'd moved to a nicer apartment. He didn't bother to look any deeper than that because Coulson Whitfield had never once considered the possibility that Nicole Carter could become something greater than him. So he slipped a wedding invitation into the mail, and on the back, in his own handwriting, he wrote 7 words that would become the biggest mistake of his life. Thought my poor desperate ex should see what she missed out on. See. He sealed the envelope with a smirk on his face. He thought he was winning. He thought this was the final move in a game he'd been playing for 12 years. Proof that he'd made the right choice, that his life was better without her, that he was the one who came out on top. But that invitation wasn't a power move. It was a window into the soul of a man who was so insecure, so hollow, so desperate to prove his own worth, that he needed the woman he'd thrown away to watch him marry someone else just so he could feel like he mattered. Coulson Whitfield had no idea what he'd just done. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Nicole was in her office at the Denver Tech Center, the corner office on the 14th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Front Range. She had just finished a conference call with a team of developers in Austin when her executive assistant knocked on the glass door and handed her a stack of mail. Most of it was the usual: business correspondence, partnership proposals, event invitations from organizations that wanted her name attached to their cause. But at the bottom of the stack there was an envelope that was different. Thick, cream-colored cardstock, embossed gold lettering, the kind of envelope that announces itself before you even open it. Nicole turned it over. The return address read Whitfield. She opened it slowly. Inside was a wedding invitation, elegant, excessive, dripping with the kind of wealth that needed everyone to know it existed. Coulson Reed Whitfield and Felicity Ann Hargrove. The Broadmoor, Colorado Springs. 300 guests, black tie. Then she turned the invitation over, and there, on the back, in handwriting she hadn't seen in over a decade but recognized immediately, were 7 words. Thought my poor desperate ex should see what she missed out on. Nicole read it once, then twice, then a third time. She set the invitation down on her desk, leaned back in her chair, and looked out those floor-to-ceiling windows at the big Colorado sky, the same sky that had watched over her since she was a little girl in Park Hill, the same sky that had held her tears and her triumphs and every single thing in between. And she smiled. Not a sad smile. Not a vengeful smile. A knowing smile. The kind of smile that comes from a woman who has walked through fire and come out the other side wearing a crown. "Oh, Coulson," she whispered to the empty office. "You have absolutely no idea what's coming." She picked up her phone and called her assistant. "Clear my schedule for April 19th. I'm going to a wedding." That evening, Nicole went home to her house in Washington Park. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea, Nana Mae's recipe, the one with extra honey and a pinch of cinnamon, and sat on the back porch as the sun went down behind the mountains. She held the warm mug in both hands the way Nana Mae used to, and for a moment the grief hit her the way it always did. Sudden, sharp, like stepping on broken glass you didn't see coming. Nana Mae had passed away in 2021. She was 83 years old. She went peacefully in her sleep, in the guest bedroom of Nicole's home, the home Nicole had bought specifically so her grandmother would never have to work another day in her life. Nana Mae spent her last 2 years being taken care of by the granddaughter she had raised. She got to see Nicole's company grow. She got to watch Archie become the brilliant young man she always knew he would be. She got to rest. And when she left this world, she left it knowing that everything she had poured into Nicole, every prayer, every sacrifice, every plate of sweet potato pie, every whispered, "Baby, the world ain't gonna hand you nothing," had bloomed into something extraordinary. Nicole missed her every single day. But on this particular evening, sitting on her porch with that chamomile tea, she could almost hear Nana Mae's voice in the breeze. "Baby, you already know what to do." And she did. Nicole's intention was not revenge. She wanted to be very clear about that, in her own heart and in her own mind. She was not going to Coulson's wedding to cause a scene. She was not going to humiliate him, or ruin his day, or stand up during the ceremony and announce his sins to 300 strangers. That wasn't who she was. That wasn't who Nana Mae raised. She was going for truth. She wanted Coulson to see, with his own 2 eyes, what he had thrown away. Not so she could win him back. She didn't want him. She hadn't wanted him in years. She wanted him to see it so that he would have to live with it, so that every time he closed his eyes for the rest of his life, he would see the woman he called nothing, standing in front of him as everything. That was enough. Truth was enough. But there was someone else in that house who had a say in this decision, and his say mattered more than anyone's. Nicole had never hidden the truth about Archie's father from him. She had told him age-appropriately, starting when he was 6 years old, in small pieces that a child's heart could hold without breaking. "Your daddy lives in another part of Denver. He wasn't ready to be a father when you were born, but that has nothing to do with how special you are." As Archie grew older, the pieces got bigger. By the time he was 12, he knew the full story. The relationship, the secret, the pregnancy, the rejection, the $5,000 check, all of it. Nicole never spoke about Coulson with bitterness. She spoke about him with honesty. And Archie, with the quiet maturity that had defined him since he was old enough to take apart alarm clocks, absorbed it all without anger. But that evening, when Nicole showed him the invitation and let him read the note on the back, something shifted in Archie's face. He went quiet. Not the quiet of a boy who was upset, the quiet of a boy who was making a decision. He set the invitation down on the kitchen counter, looked at his mother, with those pale blue eyes, his father's eyes, and said, "I want to go." Nicole's heart clenched. "Baby, you don't have to. I want to go, Mama." His voice was steady, calm, 12 years old and already carrying himself like a man who understood the weight of his own words. "He should know I exist. Not for him. For me. I need him to see me just once." Nicole looked at her son. This boy who had built apps that changed lives, who had his father's eyes but his mother's heart, who had never once complained about growing up without a dad even though he had every right to. This boy who deserved so much better than a father who had tried to erase him before he was even born. She wanted to protect him. Every fiber of her being wanted to shield him from whatever might happen at that wedding. The rejection, the awkwardness, the possibility that Coulson would look at his own son and feel nothing. She had spent 12 years building a wall between Archie and that pain. But she also knew, the way mothers know things that logic can't explain, that she couldn't protect him from this forever. This was his story too. And he had the right to write this chapter himself. Nicole pulled Archie into her arms and held him tight. He was almost as tall as her now. When did that happen? When did her baby become this brave, steady, extraordinary young man? She kissed the top of his curly head and whispered, "Okay, we'll go together." The next morning, Nicole picked up her phone and made a call to a woman named Zuri, her personal stylist. Zuri operated out of a boutique studio in Cherry Creek, which was an irony that was never lost on Nicole. Cherry Creek, the same neighborhood where the Whitfields lived, the same zip code that Coulson had used as proof of his superiority for his entire life. And now Nicole was spending money there like it was nothing. Because it was nothing. Not anymore. Zuri answered on the second ring. Nicole didn't waste time with small talk. "I need 2 looks. One for me, one for my son. And Zuri, I need them to be unforgettable." Within a week, Zuri had sourced a custom deep emerald green gown from a black designer based in Atlanta. The fabric was hand-selected, a rich, liquid silk that caught light like it had been woven from crushed gemstones. The cut was elegant but powerful, fitted through the bodice, flowing at the hem, with a neckline that was sophisticated without trying too hard. It was the kind of dress that didn't ask for attention. It commanded it. When Nicole tried it on for the first fitting and looked at herself in the full-length mirror, Zuri stood behind her with her arms folded and said, "Girl, that man is going to need a paramedic." For Archie, Zuri put together a tailored navy blue suit, slim fit, modern cut, with a crisp white shirt underneath and an emerald green pocket square that matched his mother's gown perfectly. When Archie tried it on, he stood in front of the mirror and adjusted his cuffs the way he'd seen his mother adjust hers before business meetings. He looked at himself, really looked, and for the first time, Nicole saw something flash across her son's face that she'd never seen before. It wasn't vanity. It was readiness. This 12-year-old boy was preparing himself to meet the man who had never wanted him, and he was going to do it standing tall. She called her travel coordinator and booked a Gulfstream G650 from Centennial Airport in South Denver to Colorado Springs Airport. The flight was 15 minutes. 15. She could have driven. It was barely an hour and a half down I-25. She could have taken a car service. She could have been practical about it. But Nicole Carter wasn't going to be practical. Not today. Because this wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. This was a statement. This was a woman who had been told she had nothing, arriving in a $65 million private jet to the wedding of the man who said it. Every detail mattered. Every choice was intentional. And when that jet touched down in Colorado Springs, it would carry with it 12 years of proof that Coulson Reed Whitfield had made the worst decision of his life. Now, while Nicole and Archie were preparing in Denver, the scene at the Broadmoor was already taking shape. If you've never been to the Broadmoor, let me paint it for you. It sits at the foot of Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado Springs, a sprawling, historic luxury resort that has hosted presidents, dignitaries, and some of the wealthiest families in American history. The grounds are immaculate. The architecture is grand without being gaudy, and on this particular Saturday afternoon, the West Terrace had been transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. White roses and peonies were arranged in towering displays along the aisle. Cascading greenery hung from a hand-carved marble arch at the altar, swaying gently in the warm Colorado breeze. 300 gilded chairs were arranged in perfect rows on either side of a cream-colored runner that stretched from the terrace entrance to the arch. The sun was high and golden, and behind the altar, the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains rose against a cloudless blue sky like God himself had painted the backdrop for this occasion. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the guests began arriving. Mercedes, Bentleys, Teslas. A procession of luxury vehicles lined up at the valet station like a car show for the Colorado elite. Women in designer dresses and men in tailored suits filtered through the terrace entrance, greeting each other with air kisses and champagne flutes. Politicians shook hands with business owners. Old money mingled with new money. Everyone smiled. Everyone performed. It was a Whitfield wedding after all. And at a Whitfield wedding, appearances were the only currency that mattered. And there, at the center of it all, stood Coulson Reed Whitfield. He wore a tailored black tuxedo that fit him like it had been sewn onto his body. His sandy blonde hair was swept to the side. His pale blue eyes carried that familiar Whitfield confidence, the kind that comes not from knowing who you are, but from making sure everyone else believes you do. He greeted every guest with a firm handshake and that polished smile, the one he'd been practicing since childhood, the one that said everything is perfect even when nothing was. Beside him stood Felicity Ann Hargrove, soon to be Felicity Whitfield, in a stunning Vera Wang gown, her blonde hair pinned in an elegant updo, her smile warm and genuine. She looked beautiful. She looked happy. She had no idea what was coming. The orchestra began to warm up. The guests took their seats. The Colorado sun bathed the West Terrace in golden light. Everything was in place. Every flower, every chair, every champagne glass, every carefully curated detail of this $400,000 production was exactly where it was supposed to be. Perfect, polished, untouchable, and 15 minutes away, in a Gulfstream G650 descending toward Colorado Springs Airport, a woman in an emerald green gown sat beside her 12-year-old son. She held his hand, he held hers. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. The stage was set, the audience was seated, and Nicole Carter was almost there. It was 3:45 in the afternoon. 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The guests were already seated on the West Terrace. The orchestra was playing a soft, elegant melody that floated through the warm Colorado air like silk. Champagne flutes were half empty. Conversations were winding down. People were settling into their chairs, adjusting their jackets, crossing their ankles, preparing to witness the union of Colson Reed Whitfield and Felicity Ann Hargrove. Everything was calm. Everything was controlled. Everything was exactly the way a Whitfield event was supposed to be. And then someone near the entrance turned their head. It started as a murmur, a quiet ripple at the back of the terrace, the kind of sound that happens when something catches one person's eye and they nudge the person next to them. Then the murmur became a buzz. Then the buzz became a roar, not a loud roar, but the kind that moves through a crowd like electricity, jumping from row to row, chair to chair, whisper to whisper, until every single person on that terrace had stopped what they were doing and turned to look at the same thing. A black Escalade with tinted windows had pulled up to the Broadmoor's grand entrance. The valet stepped forward and opened the rear passenger door, and the woman who stepped out of that vehicle made 300 of Colorado's wealthiest, most powerful, most well-connected people forget how to breathe. Nicole Denise Carter stood in the golden afternoon light wearing that custom deep emerald green gown, and she looked like she had been carved from something the rest of the world didn't have access to. Her natural hair was swept into an elegant updo, not stiff, not overdone, but regal, adorned with delicate gold accessories that caught the sunlight every time she moved. Diamond earrings hung from her ears, each one catching the Colorado sun and throwing tiny rainbows across her collarbone. Her posture was straight. Her chin was lifted. Her eyes, those deep brown eyes that had cried on a kitchen floor, that had stared at disconnect notices, that had watched her grandmother take her last breath, those eyes were steady. Calm, unshakable. She didn't look like a guest. She looked like royalty. No, she looked like a queen who had built her throne with her own 2 hands and didn't need a single person on that terrace to validate it. Then the other door opened, and Archie stepped out, 12 years old, tall for his age, already 5'7" and still growing, light brown skin that glowed in the afternoon sun, a head full of curly hair that he wore with the same quiet, confidence his mother carried in her posture. He straightened his navy suit jacket, adjusted his emerald pocket square, and stood beside his mother with the composure of someone twice his age. He didn't fidget. He didn't look nervous. He looked ready. And then there were his eyes, those pale blue eyes, unmistakable, undeniable, impossible to ignore. Whitfield eyes. On a 12-year-old boy standing at the entrance of a Whitfield wedding, Nicole extended her arm. Archie took it, and together, mother and son, arm in arm, they walked toward the West Terrace. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Guests who had been standing near the entrance stepped aside without being asked, their mouths slightly open, their champagne flutes frozen halfway to their lips. Nicole walked through them with the grace of a woman who had earned every single step she was taking, not inherited it, not married into it, not been handed it by a father with a family name. Earned it. Every step was 12 years of sacrifice. Every step was a late night and an early morning. Every step was a kitchen floor she got up from and a company she built from nothing. And the whispers, oh, the whispers. Is that Nicole Carter? The Nicole Carter from Forbes? That's the CEO of Archie Technologies, the $500 million company. Wait, is that her son? That's the kid who built Homelink. Oh my God. Why does that boy look so familiar? Look at his eyes, look at his eyes. The whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. People who had never met Nicole recognized her from magazine covers and news segments. People who had never heard of her couldn't stop staring because there was something about the way she carried herself that made you understand, without being told, that this woman was not ordinary. And the boy beside her, the boy with the blue eyes and the navy suit and the quiet, steady presence, he was the question that every single person on that terrace was suddenly trying to answer. Why does he look like the groom? Nicole kept walking. She didn't stop to explain. She didn't pause to acknowledge the stares. She walked with her head high and her son on her arm, and every step she took echoed off the stone pathway like a heartbeat. Now, I need y'all to pause for a second. If you're watching this right now and your heart is pounding, if you can feel the tension building in your chest like something is about to happen that you can't look away from, I need you to hit that like button. Right now. Hit it. And share this video with someone who's ever been counted out. Someone who's ever been told they weren't enough. Someone who's ever been thrown away by a person who didn't know what they had. Share it with them. Because what happens next? You are not ready. Nicole saw him before he saw her. Coulson was standing near the edge of the terrace, just a few feet from the entrance where the stone pathway met the rows of gilded chairs. He had his back half-turned, shaking hands with a guest, laughing that rehearsed Whitfield laugh. The one that sounded right, but never quite reached his eyes. He hadn't noticed the whispers yet. He hadn't noticed the shift in the crowd. He was still living in the last few seconds of the life he thought he had. Then he turned around. For a moment, just a fraction of a moment, his brain didn't register what his eyes were showing him. It had been over 12 years. She looked different. Not different in the way people look when they've aged or worn down. Different in the way people look when they've become who they were always meant to be. The woman standing 20 feet in front of him wasn't the bartender from Ember. She wasn't the girl in the 5 Points apartment. She was something else entirely. And his brain needed a second to catch up. Then it caught up. Confusion came first. His brow furrowed. His head tilted slightly to the left the way it always did when something didn't make sense. Why was she here? How did she? And then he remembered. The invitation. The note. The 7 words he'd written with a smirk on his face, thinking he was clever, thinking he was winning. She came, she actually came. Then came recognition. His eyes widened. His lips parted. The color in his face shifted, not gone yet, but fading, like a photograph left too long in the sun. He recognized her fully now. Nicole Carter. Standing at his wedding in a gown that cost more than most of the cars in the parking lot, looking like she owned every square inch of the ground beneath her feet. Then came shock. His body stiffened. His shoulders pulled back. His hand, which had been extended toward a guest he was greeting, dropped to his side like it had been cut from a string. This wasn't what he expected. This wasn't the poor, desperate ex he'd imagined showing up in a department store dress, sitting quietly in the back row, watching him marry Felicity and feeling the sting of what she'd lost. This was a woman who had walked in like she owned the Broadmoor itself. Then came disbelief. His jaw loosened. His mouth opened slightly. His pale blue eyes, those Whitfield eyes, darted from Nicole's face to her gown, to the diamond earrings, to the gold in her hair, and every detail he absorbed made the disbelief grow deeper. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be the same woman. This couldn't be. And then his eyes landed on the boy standing beside her. The boy in the navy suit with the emerald pocket square, the boy who was 12 years old and tall for his age, with light brown skin and a head full of curly hair and a jawline that Coulson saw every single morning in his own bathroom mirror. And then came the fifth emotion, the one that swallowed all the others whole. Terror. Because Archie Denise Carter looked exactly like Coulson Reed Whitfield. The same jawline, the same nose, the same structure in the cheekbones, and the eyes. God, the eyes. Those pale blue eyes staring back at him were his own. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected not his face but 12 years of consequences. 12 years of silence. 12 years of a son he had tried to erase standing right in front of him, alive and real and undeniable. Coulson's face went white. Not pale, white. Like every drop of blood in his body had retreated to his heart to keep it from stopping. Nicole walked forward. Slowly, deliberately. Every step measured, every breath controlled. She stopped directly in front of Coulson, close enough to see the vein pulsing in his neck, close enough to smell the cologne he still wore, the same one from 12 years ago. The crowd behind her had gone dead silent. The orchestra, which had been playing a soft melody just moments ago, had stopped. The musicians had lowered their instruments. Even they could feel it. Something was happening that no sheet music had prepared them for. The only sound on that entire terrace was the mountain breeze moving through the flowers. Nicole looked Coulson directly in the eyes. Those eyes she used to love. Those eyes she now saw reflected in her son every single day. And she spoke. Her voice was calm. Steady, not loud, but every person on that terrace heard every word. "Hello, Coulson, thank you for the invitation. This is my son Archie, but I think you might already see the resemblance." Coulson's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His lips moved like a man trying to speak underwater, forming shapes that never became words. His hands hung at his sides, useless. His eyes kept darting between Nicole and Archie, back and forth, like his brain was trying to solve an equation it already knew the answer to but refused to accept. Then a voice came from beside him. Felicity. She had been standing just a few feet away, greeting guests with the warm, genuine smile she'd worn all afternoon. But now that smile was gone. She was staring at Archie, staring at his face, staring at those eyes, and the realization was crawling across her expression like a crack spreading through glass. "Coulson?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Who is this?" She looked at Archie again, then at Coulson, then back at Archie. Her hand rose slowly to her mouth. "Why does this boy look like—" She stopped. Her fingers pressed against her lips, her eyes filled with something that wasn't anger yet. It was the moment right before anger. The moment when the truth is still forming and the heart hasn't decided whether to break or burn. "Coulson?" Coulson didn't answer her. He couldn't. He was frozen. A man standing in the wreckage of his own lies, watching every wall he'd ever built come crashing down in real time. Then a heavy footstep. Garrison Whitfield, tall, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, the patriarch of the Whitfield family, stepped forward from the front row. His face was hard. His voice was harder. "What is the meaning of this?" Nicole turned to face him. She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She stood in front of Garrison Whitfield, the same way she stood in front of boardrooms and investors and television cameras, with the quiet, unshakable authority of a woman who had earned her place in every room she'd ever entered. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, her voice clear as the Colorado sky above them, "my name is Nicole Carter. I'm the CEO of Archie Technologies. Your son and I dated 12 years ago." She placed her hand gently on Archie's shoulder. "This is Archie. He's 12 years old. And he's your grandson." The word landed like a boulder dropped into still water. Grandson. The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a knife and served it as wedding cake. 300 people. 300 of Colorado's most prominent, most powerful, most carefully composed people, sat in their gilded chairs with their mouths open and their champagne going flat. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Nobody even blinked. Prudence Whitfield grabbed Garrison's arm, not out of affection but out of the desperate need to hold on to something solid because the ground beneath her was crumbling. The bridesmaids standing near the altar were frozen in their lavender dresses like statues in a garden nobody would ever visit again. The groomsmen stared at Coulson with expressions that ranged from confusion to pity to barely concealed horror. And the guests, every last one of them, held their breath, waiting for something, anything to break the silence. But the only person who could break it was Coulson. And Coulson was standing in the middle of his own $400,000 wedding, surrounded by 300 witnesses, face to face with the son he had abandoned and the woman he had discarded, watching his entire world burn to the ground in broad daylight. And he couldn't say a single word. And then Archie stepped forward. Not quickly, not dramatically. He didn't push past his mother or raise his voice or point his finger. He simply took one step forward, one calm, steady, deliberate step, and stood in front of the man who had never wanted him. 12 years old, standing in a tailored navy suit on the west terrace of the Broadmoor, surrounded by 300 silent strangers, looking up at the father who had tried to erase him before he even took his first breath. And this boy, this extraordinary, brave, impossible boy, didn't yell. He didn't cry. He didn't tremble. He spoke. "I didn't come here to ruin your day." His voice was clear, steady. It carried across the terrace the way truth always does. Without force, without volume, just weight. Pure, undeniable weight. "I came here because I wanted to see you. Just once." Coulson's lips parted. His chin dipped. His eyes, those pale blue eyes that were staring back at their own reflection in his son's face, began to glisten. "My mama raised me by herself. She worked every day. She stayed up every night. She built a whole company. She taught me everything I know. She taught me how to be kind. She taught me how to be brave. She taught me that your worth isn't what somebody gives you. It's what you build when they give you nothing." A woman in the third row pressed her hand to her chest. Her shoulders shook. Then the woman beside her lowered her head and wiped her eyes. Then a man 2 rows back cleared his throat and looked away because he didn't want anyone to see what was happening to his face. And then, like a wave that starts with a single ripple and swallows the entire shore, half the terrace was crying. Quietly, openly, uncontrollably. 300 people who had come to watch a wedding were now watching something far more important. A 12-year-old boy standing in front of his father for the first time, telling him the truth that no amount of money or status or Whitfield pride could outrun. Archie took a breath, and then he said the words that broke Coulson Reed Whitfield in half. "I just wanted you to see, we turned out okay. We turned out okay." 5 words. That's all it took. 5 words from a boy who had every right to be angry, every right to scream, every right to stand on that terrace and list every single thing his father had missed. The first steps, the first words, the birthdays, the science fairs, the late nights coding, the app that changed thousands of lives, the magazine covers, the company worth $500 million. He could have thrown all of it in Coulson's face. He had earned that right. But he didn't, because Nicole Carter didn't raise a boy who tears people down. She raised a boy who tells the truth and lets the truth do the work. Coulson's lip trembled. His jaw tightened, then loosened, then tightened again. A man fighting a war with his own face. His eyes were wet now, fully wet, and a single tear broke free and slid down his left cheek. He stood there, in his tailored tuxedo, in front of his 300 guests, on the most expensive day of his life. And there was no script for this. No playbook, no family money, no Whitfield name, no amount of anything that could fix what was happening to him in this moment. He was standing face to face with the son he had abandoned, and the woman he had called someone who has nothing. And that woman was worth $500 million, with more dignity in her pinky finger than Coulson had in his entire body. Nicole placed her hand on Archie's shoulder, gently, proudly, the way a mother touches her child when she wants the whole world to know. "This is mine. I made this, and I'd do it all again." "We're not here to cause trouble," Nicole said. Her voice was warm but firm. "We were invited, and we just wanted to please reply, in person." She let that land. Then she turned not to Coulson, not to Garrison, not to the crowd, but to Felicity. Felicity, who was standing 3 feet away with tears streaming down her face, and her Vera Wang gown suddenly feeling like a costume for a play she hadn't auditioned for. Nicole looked at her with something that wasn't pity and wasn't superiority. It was empathy. Real, honest empathy. "I'm sorry you're finding out this way," Nicole said softly. "You deserve better than secrets. Trust me, I know what that feels like." Felicity's chin quivered. She didn't respond. She couldn't. But something passed between the 2 women in that moment, a silent understanding that only people who have been lied to by the same kind of man can share. Nicole turned back to Archie. She extended her arm. He took it, and together, the same way they had arrived, mother and son, arm in arm, they turned and walked back toward the grand entrance. The crowd parted again. But this time nobody whispered, nobody murmured, nobody said a single word. The only sounds on that entire terrace were Nicole's heels clicking against the stone pathway, steady, rhythmic, unhurried, and somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of a Gulfstream G650 waiting on the tarmac to take them home. They reached the Escalade. The driver opened the door, and just before Archie climbed in, he looked up at his mother. "Mama, are you okay?" Nicole looked down at her son. Her miracle. Her purpose. Her proof that God doesn't make mistakes, not even when the world tries to convince you he did. She looked at this boy who had just done the bravest thing she had ever witnessed. Braver than any boardroom negotiation, braver than any TED stage, braver than anything she had ever done in her entire life. He had stood in front of the man who threw him away and said, "We turned out okay," and he meant it. Nicole smiled, not the knowing smile from her office when she read the invitation. Not the polished smile she wore for cameras and conferences. This was a different smile. This was the smile of a mother whose heart was so full it could barely stay inside her chest. "Baby," she said, "I've never been better." Archie smiled back. They climbed in. The door closed. The Escalade pulled away from the Broadmoor, down the long tree-lined drive, past the mountains, past the flowers, past the $400,000 fairy tale that had just crumbled in the Colorado sun. Behind them, 300 stunned guests, one devastated groom, one shattered bride, and one wedding that would never ever be the same. Now, you might be wondering, what happened after Nicole and Archie drove away? Did the wedding just stop? No, it didn't, because Prudence Whitfield did not spend $400,000 on flowers from Ecuador and a 12-piece orchestra and 300 hand-calligraphed invitations to let a little thing like the truth cancel her son's wedding. Prudence straightened her jacket, lifted her chin, turned to the guests, and said, with the kind of composure that only comes from decades of pretending everything is fine, "Please, take your seats. The ceremony will begin shortly." And it did. The ceremony happened. The vows were exchanged. But if you had been sitting in one of those gilded chairs on the West Terrace, you would have felt it. The difference between a wedding and a performance. This was a performance. Felicity stood at the altar in her gown and said her vows, but they were short, clipped, the kind of vows a woman recites when her mouth is moving but her mind is somewhere else entirely. She smiled, but the smile never reached her eyes. It sat on her lips like something borrowed, which, in a way, it was. And she never looked at Coulson. Not once. Not during the vows. Not during the ring exchange. Not when the officiant said the words that were supposed to seal their future together. She looked past him. Through him. Like he was already a ghost. The reception moved to the main ballroom. The orchestra played. The champagne flowed. The 4-course dinner was served. Filet mignon, roasted vegetables, truffle risotto, the works. But Coulson sat at the head table like a man attending his own funeral. His plate sat in front of him untouched. His champagne glass stayed full. His eyes were fixed on some invisible point in the middle distance, and anyone who looked at him could see it. This man was not here. His body was in a chair, but his mind was standing on the West Terrace watching a 12-year-old boy in a navy suit tell him we turned out okay. The best man stood up to give his toast. He made a joke, something about Coulson finally being off the market. Nobody laughed. The silence that followed was so loud it had its own heartbeat. The best man cleared his throat, mumbled something about wishing the couple well, and sat back down. 300 people stared at their plates. The orchestra played louder to fill the void. It didn't help. By 10 o'clock that evening, Felicity was on the phone with her mother. By midnight she had packed a single bag, removed her ring, and left the Broadmoor without saying goodbye to Coulson. She didn't scream. She didn't throw things. She didn't cause a scene. Felicity Ann Hargrove handled the worst night of her life with more class than Coulson had shown in his entire existence. Within 72 hours, she had filed for an annulment. Her statement was brief and dignified. She wished Coulson well, she asked for privacy, and she made it clear that she had entered the marriage without full knowledge of the facts. That was it. No drama. No public war. Just a woman who had been lied to choosing to walk away with her head held high. And Coulson? Coulson was alone. He sat in the honeymoon suite at the Broadmoor, the suite that was supposed to be the beginning of his new life with Felicity. The champagne was untouched on the nightstand. The rose petals on the bed looked like evidence at a crime scene. Coulson had stripped down to his tuxedo pants and an undershirt. His jacket was on the floor. His bow tie was hanging from the bathroom doorknob, and in his hand was a glass of bourbon, not the first one, not the second one, and not the last. And then he cried. Not the kind of crying you see in movies, the single tear, the clenched jaw, the dignified grief of a man who's been through something hard. No, this was ugly crying, the kind that comes from a place so deep inside you that it doesn't care what it looks like on the way out. His body shook, his face contorted. Snot ran down his upper lip and he didn't wipe it. He gasped for air between sobs like a man drowning in a room with no water. 12 years of denial, 12 years of pretending he hadn't done what he'd done, 12 years of convincing himself that walking away from Nicole and their unborn child was the right decision. All of it collapsed at once. The walls he'd built around that guilt didn't crumble slowly. They detonated, and everything he'd been hiding from came flooding in. We turned out okay. Those 4 words. Those 4 simple, devastating, merciful words from a 12-year-old boy who had every right to hate him, but chose grace instead. They echoed in Coulson's skull like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. And with every echo came a flash of everything he had missed. First steps he wasn't there for. First words he never heard. Birthdays he never knew about. School plays he never attended. Bedtime stories he never read. A son who learned to code on his mother's laptop and built an app that changed thousands of lives. And his father didn't even know his name until he was standing in front of him at a wedding. Coulson set the bourbon down. He picked up his phone. He found Nicole's number. He'd kept it all these years, buried in his contacts, never deleted, never dialed. And he called. No answer. He called again. No answer. He sent a text. His hands were shaking so badly the words came out with typos he had to correct 3 times before hitting send. Please, I need to talk to you. About Archie. About everything. Nicole read that text the next morning. She was sitting in her office at the Denver Tech Center, sipping a cup of Naname's chamomile tea, watching the sun rise over the Front Range. She read the message once. She set her phone face down on the desk, and she waited. She waited a full week, not out of pettiness, not out of revenge, not because she wanted Coulson to suffer. He was already doing that on his own. She waited because she needed to think. She needed to sit with a decision and make sure that whatever she did next was right, not for her, not for Coulson, but for Archie. Every decision Nicole had made for the past 12 years had been filtered through one question. Is this good for my son? And this decision, whether to open the door between Archie and the man who had abandoned him, was the biggest one yet. After 7 days, Nicole picked up her phone and called Coulson back. He answered before the first ring finished. Nicole didn't waste time. Her voice was direct, firm, not cold, but clear, the voice of a woman who had spent 12 years protecting her son and was not about to stop now. If you want to know your son, you do it consistently, honestly, and on his terms, not yours. You don't get to show up when it's convenient and disappear when it's hard. You don't get to play father when it makes you feel good and ghost when it doesn't. You show up, every time. Or you don't show up at all. Those are your options. Coulson was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I understand. Nicole said, We'll see. 2 weeks after the wedding, on a quiet Tuesday morning, Archie Denise Carter walked into a coffee shop in Washington Park. It was a small place, exposed brick walls, mismatched wooden chairs, the smell of fresh espresso, and cinnamon rolls hanging in the air. The kind of neighborhood spot where people came to read, or work on their laptops, or have conversations they'd been putting off for too long. Nicole had chosen it on purpose. Neutral ground. Public space. Close to home, and close to the black Range Rover parked across the street where Nicole sat in the driver's seat with her window cracked, her phone in her hand, and her eyes on the front door. Mama Bear doesn't go far. Archie pushed the door open and scanned the room. He found Coulson in the back corner, sitting at a 2-person table near the window. And the first thing Archie noticed was that Coulson Reed Whitfield looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. His eyes were red-rimmed and heavy. His skin had a grayish tint that no amount of expensive moisturizer could hide. His clothes, a plain button-down and slacks, were wrinkled in places that told you he'd gotten dressed without looking in the mirror. The polished, confident, Whitfield perfect version of Coulson that had stood at the altar 2 weeks ago was gone. The man sitting in this coffee shop was what was left after the performance ended. Archie walked over. He pulled out the chair across from Coulson and sat down. "Hi," Archie said. "Hi," Coulson said. His voice cracked on that single syllable, split right down the middle like a piece of wood that couldn't hold its own weight anymore. They sat there for a moment. The silence between them was thick but not hostile. It was the silence of two people who shared the same blood, but none of the same memories, trying to figure out where to begin when there was no beginning that made sense. Archie broke it first. Because of course he did. Nicole Carter's son was never the one to sit in uncomfortable silence when a well-placed sentence could cut right through it. "So," Archie said, leaning back in his chair with a half-smile that was pure Nicole. "This is weird, right?" Coulson let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a breath he'd been holding for 14 days. "Yeah," he said. "This is weird." "Cool," Archie said. "Just making sure we're on the same page." And just like that, with the kind of effortless grace that only a 12-year-old who's been raised right can pull off, the ice was broken. They talked for 2 hours. 2 full hours in that little coffee shop in Washington Park, and Archie did most of the talking at first. Not because Coulson didn't want to speak, but because Coulson didn't know how. He didn't know how to talk to his own son. He didn't know what questions to ask. He didn't know what was safe and what would open a wound he wasn't ready to stitch. So he listened, and Archie, generous, open, brave in the way only kids who've been loved well can be, gave him something to listen to. He told Coulson about HomeLink, how he'd built it at 10 years old after volunteering at a shelter on Park Avenue West, and realizing that the biggest problem wasn't that people didn't want to help, it was that they didn't know how to find the help that already existed. He told him about the other apps, the one connecting foster youth with mentors, the one mapping affordable housing. He told him about school, his favorite subjects, his teachers, his friends. He told him about building computers from scratch in the garage, taking apart old motherboards and putting them back together just to see if he could make them faster. And he told him about his mama's jerk chicken, how she made it every Sunday with Nana Mae's recipe, Scotch bonnet peppers and all, and how the whole house smelled like the Caribbean by noon, and how it was the best thing he'd ever eaten in his life, and nobody could tell him different. Coulson listened. Really listened. Not the way he listened in boardrooms. Half present, waiting for his turn to talk, already forming his response before the other person finished their sentence. He listened the way a man listens when he understands that every word coming out of this boy's mouth is a gift he doesn't deserve. He listened like his life depended on it. Maybe because it did. And then, somewhere near the end of the second hour, after the coffee had gone cold and the cinnamon rolls were nothing but crumbs on a plate, Archie went quiet. He looked down at the table. He traced a circle on the wood with his fingertip. And when he looked back up, his eyes, those pale blue eyes that were identical to the ones staring back at him, were steady but serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything," Coulson said. "Why didn't you want me?" The question landed on the table between them like something heavy and fragile at the same time. Coulson's jaw tightened. His eyes dropped. His hands, which had been resting on the table, curled into loose fists, not out of anger, but out of the effort it took to keep himself together. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the barista behind the counter glanced over. Long enough that the ambient noise of the coffee shop seemed to fade into nothing. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough and stripped of every layer of Whitfield polish he'd ever worn. "Because I was a coward." He paused, swallowed hard. "I was raised to believe that everything in life was about status, about money, about what things looked like from the outside. My father taught me that. His father taught him that. And when I met your mother, when I fell in love with your mother, she didn't fit the box. She wasn't from the right neighborhood. She didn't come from the right family. She didn't have the right bank account. And instead of throwing the box away, which is what I should have done, which is what any man with a spine would have done, I threw her away instead." His voice cracked again. "And I threw you away with her. And that box I was so desperate to stay inside of, it was a prison. It's been a prison my whole life. And not wanting you, not fighting for you, not showing up for you, not being there for every single day of your life, was the worst decision I have ever made, and I will carry that for the rest of my life." Archie didn't look away. He held Coulson's gaze the entire time, not with anger, not with forgiveness, but with something in between. Something that said, "I hear you, and I'm deciding what to do with this at the same time." Then Archie nodded slowly. "I'll let you try," he said. His voice was calm, measured, 12 years old and already fluent in the language of boundaries, because his mother had taught him that language from the day he was born. "But if you ever disrespect my mama again—" He leaned forward slightly. "We're NNA have a problem." Coulson looked at this boy, this extraordinary, terrifying, magnificent boy, and a tear slid down his cheek. He didn't wipe it. He let it fall. "You're definitely her son," he whispered. Archie's lips curved into a small, knowing smile, the same smile Nicole wore when she read that wedding invitation in her corner office. "The best parts of me are. Now, I need you to understand something. Nicole and Coulson did not get back together. This is not that story. There was no romantic reconciliation. No candlelit dinner where old feelings resurfaced. No Hollywood ending where the man who abandoned his family suddenly becomes the hero. That's not how this works. That's not how real life works. And Nicole Carter, the woman who built a $500 million empire from a kitchen floor, did not need a man to complete her story. She never did. But what Nicole and Coulson did build, slowly, imperfectly, painfully, was a CO parenting relationship, and if you think that was easy, you haven't been paying attention. There were arguments. There were boundaries that got tested and lines that got crossed, and old wounds that reopened when neither of them expected it. There were phone calls that ended with someone hanging up. There were weeks where the tension was so thick that Archie had to be the adult in the room, and he was 12. But there was also consistency, and that's what mattered. Coulson started showing up. Not perfectly. He missed one of Archie's school events in the first month, and Nicole called him and read him the riot act so thoroughly that Coulson went home and set 17 alarms on his phone for every event on Archie's calendar for the rest of the year. He never missed another one. And then Coulson did something nobody expected. He started to change. Not overnight, not in some dramatic made-for-television transformation. Slowly, quietly, in ways that most people wouldn't even notice unless they were paying close attention. He left the dealership, walked away from the VP title his father had handed him in the office he'd never earned. Garrison didn't speak to him for 3 months. Coulson didn't care. He started volunteering with a program for fatherless boys in Aurora, showing up every Saturday morning, mentoring kids who reminded him of everything he'd almost let Archie become. A boy without a father. A statistic. A story that ended before it started. He went to therapy. Real therapy. Not the kind where you sit on a couch and talk about your childhood for 50 minutes and then go back to being the same person. The kind where you sit in a room with a stranger and say the things out loud that you've been hiding from your whole life, and it breaks you open, and you have to figure out how to put yourself back together as someone better. He read the books Nicole recommended, not because she asked him to, but because Archie mentioned them in conversation, and Coulson wanted to understand the world his son lived in. And he donated a significant portion of his trust fund money to HomeLink. Not for publicity. Not for a tax write-off. Not to impress Nicole. He did it because his son had built something that was saving lives, and the least he could do, the absolute bare minimum, was help fund it. Coulson Reed Whitfield did not change to win Nicole back. He changed because he looked into the eyes of his 12-year-old son and saw everything he could have been if someone had taught him that love isn't a transaction. And he decided, late, imperfect, stumbling, to become the kind of man who deserved to sit across the table from Archie Denise Carter and call himself his father. He wasn't there yet, but he was trying, and for the first time in his life, trying actually meant something. While Coulson was busy learning how to become a human being, Nicole Carter kept doing what Nicole Carter does best. She kept building. Archie Technologies went international. First Canada, a partnership with housing authorities in Toronto and Vancouver to bring HomeLink across the border. Then the United Kingdom, a pilot program in London that connected rough sleepers with shelters, mental health services, and job placement programs. Then Australia, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane. The app that a 10-year-old boy had built in his mother's garage to help people in Denver find a warm bed was now operating on 3 continents. And at the center of all of it, guiding the vision, running the company, protecting her son, was Nicole Denise Carter. Time magazine named her one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Her photograph was on the cover. Not posing, not performing, just standing in front of the Denver Tech Center office with her arms crossed and a look on her face that said, "I earned this, and I dare you to question it." And then came the commencement speech. The University of Denver, the same university that had given a young woman from Park Hill a full scholarship in computer science, the same university where she had been one of 4 black women in a class of 200, invited her back to deliver the commencement address. Nicole stood at that podium in front of thousands of graduates and their families, and she spoke for 4 minutes. Just 4 minutes. And in those 4 minutes she said something that would be replayed 40 million times across every platform on the internet. When I was 26 years old, a man looked me in the eyes and told me he couldn't build a future with someone who has nothing. He said those words to me while I was carrying his child, and I want you to hear me when I say this. He was right. I had nothing. No money, no connections, no safety net, no family name that opened doors. Nothing. She paused. Let the silence breathe. But here's what he didn't understand. Here's what people like him never understand. Nothing is not the end of the sentence. Nothing is the beginning. You, every single one of you sitting in those chairs right now, you are the nothing that's about to become everything. And don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise. The auditorium erupted. 4,000 people on their feet. A standing ovation that lasted so long the university had to adjust the schedule. 40 million views in the first week. Shared by athletes, actors, CEOs, single mothers, college students, teenagers, grandparents. Shared by anyone who had ever been told they weren't enough and decided to prove the world wrong. That was Nicole Carter. Still building, still rising. Still teaching her son, and now the world, that your beginning does not dictate your ending. Months later, on a cold February evening, Valentine's Day, the house on Washington Park was full of noise. Archie Denise Carter was turning 13. The party wasn't extravagant. Nicole could have rented out a ballroom or booked a rooftop venue or flown Archie and his friends to some exotic location. She could have done any of that and not blinked at the cost. But Archie didn't want any of that. He wanted what he'd always wanted, home, so the party was at the Washington Park house. Close friends, good food, way too much cake. 3 layers, chocolate with vanilla frosting because Archie had been ordering the same cake since he was 5 and saw no reason to change now. Nicole's team was there, the people who had been with her since the early days of Carter Digital Solutions, the ones who had watched the company grow from a one-woman operation in a co-working space to an international powerhouse. Archie's school friends were there. A dozen kids crowded around the living room, laughing too loud, eating too much, being exactly what 13-year-olds are supposed to be. And Coulson was there, standing awkwardly by the snack table, holding a plate of food he wasn't eating, trying to figure out where he fit in a room full of people who had been a family long before he showed up. He looked like a man who had been invited to a party where he knew he didn't quite belong yet, but was grateful to be there anyway. And then Archie stood up. He didn't clink a glass. He didn't ask for attention. He just stood up from the couch, and something about the way he did it, the quiet confidence, the stillness, made everyone in the room stop talking and turn toward him. "I want to say something," Archie said. The room went quiet. "I used to wonder why I didn't have a dad." He said it simply. No drama, no self-pity, just a fact. The way you'd say the sky is blue or water is wet. A thing that was true and had shaped him whether he wanted it to or not. I used to sit in school and watch the other kids get picked up by their dads, and I'd wonder what was wrong with me. Why didn't I get one? What did I do? Was I not good enough? He paused. The room was so still you could hear the candles flickering on the cake. But then I'd come home, and I'd watch my mama. I'd watch her sit at that desk and code until 2 in the morning, and then wake up at 6 to make me breakfast before school. I'd watch her take phone calls from investors while helping me with my homework at the same time. I'd watch her build a company from nothing, from literally nothing, and never once complain. Never once feel sorry for herself. Never once let me see her cry, even though I know she did. His voice was steady, but his eyes were bright. And I realized nothing was wrong with me. Nothing was ever wrong with me. I had the best parent anyone could ask for. I just had one instead of two, and that one was worth more than 100 of anybody else. Nicole's hand went to her mouth. Her eyes filled. Archie turned to Coulson. Coulson, who was standing by the snack table with his plate still in his hand and tears already rolling down his face. "And now I have two," Archie said. "It's not perfect. It's messy and weird and sometimes awkward." A small laugh rippled through the room. "But it's real, and I'd rather have something real and messy than something fake and perfect." He turned back to Nicole. "Thank you, Mama, for everything. For never giving up. For never letting me believe I was less than. For being my mom and my dad and my business partner and my best friend." His voice softened. "I love you." Nicole crossed the room in 3 steps and wrapped her arms around her son. She held him the way she'd held him on the day he was born, like he was the only thing in the world that mattered, because he was. Every sleepless night on that kitchen floor. Every tear she'd wiped away when no one was watching. Every doubt that had crept in at 3 in the morning whispering you can't do this. All of it. Every single moment of it was worth it. It was all worth it for this. For him. For the boy who stood in front of a room full of people and said I had the best parent anyone could ask for, and meant it with every cell in his body. Coulson watched from across the room. The plate was shaking in his hand. Tears rolled freely down his face, and he didn't try to stop them. He finally understood, fully, completely, with no room left for denial, what he had almost destroyed, and what Nicole had saved. Not just Archie. Not just the company. Not just the legacy. She had saved the possibility of this moment. The possibility that a boy who grew up without a father could stand in a room at 13 years old and say nothing was wrong with me. And believe it. Nicole had given Archie that. She had given him the unshakable knowledge that he was loved, that he was enough, that he was extraordinary, and no absent father, no cruel words, no rejection could ever take that from him. And somewhere, in the warmth of that kitchen, in the smell of chocolate cake and jerk chicken, in the sound of a 13-year-old boy telling his mother he loved her, Nana May was there. You couldn't see her, you couldn't hear her, but if you were paying attention, if you were really paying attention, you could feel her, standing in the corner of that kitchen the way she used to stand in the corner of the kitchen on Dahlia Street, arms crossed, head tilted, watching her granddaughter hold her great-grandson, and smiling that smile that said everything words couldn't. You did good, baby, you did real good, and that is the story of Nicole Carter. If this story moved you, if it made you cry, if it made you think, if it reminded you of your own strength, or the strength of someone you love, I need you to do 3 things right now. 1. Hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Every like tells the algorithm that this story matters, and it pushes it to someone else who needs to hear it. 2. Share this video. Send it to someone who needs it today. A single parent who's fighting every day and wondering if it's worth it. Someone who's been underestimated, overlooked, written off. Someone who's building something from nothing and needs to know that it's possible. Share it with them. Let Nicole's story be the reminder they didn't know they needed. 3. Subscribe to Mr. John Stories and hit that notification bell. Because we don't just tell stories here. We tell stories that transform. Stories that make you feel something. Stories that stay with you long after the video ends. And if you're new here, welcome to the family. You're in the right place. And drop a comment below. Tell me, what's your story? What are you building? What are you fighting for? Who told you that you couldn't? And how are you proving them wrong? I read every single comment. Everyone. Now before we go, I want to leave you with 5 things that Nicole Carter's story taught us. 5 morals, and I want you to carry them with you. The first moral, know your worth, even when the world doesn't. Coulson told Nicole she was someone who has nothing. And Nicole could have believed him. She could have internalized those words and let them define her. But she didn't. She knew, deep in her bones, in the place where Nana May's voice still lived, that her worth was never determined by someone else's inability to see it. Your worth is not a number in a bank account. It's not a last name. It's not a zip code. It's what you do when the world tells you you're nothing, and you decide to become everything anyway. The second moral? Let your pain be your fuel, not your prison. Nicole could have spent 12 years being bitter. She could have spent 12 years hating Coulson, cursing his name, letting the anger eat her alive. But she didn't. She took every ounce of that pain. The rejection, the abandonment, the loneliness, the fear, and she converted it into rocket fuel. She built a company. She raised a genius. She changed the world. Pain is going to come. That's not optional. But what you do with it, that's your choice. Don't let it lock you in a cell. Let it launch you into orbit. The third moral: single parents are superheroes, and it's time the world recognized it. Nicole Carter was a mother and a father, a CEO and a bedtime story reader, a businesswoman and a homework helper. She did the work of two people every single day for 12 years, and she never once asked for a trophy. Single parents, and I'm talking to you right now, every single one of you watching this. You are doing the hardest job on the planet, and you're doing it alone. And your kids see it. They see every sacrifice. They see every late night. They see every tear you think you're hiding. And one day, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day, they're going to stand up in a room full of people and say, I had the best parent anyone could ask for. Keep going. It's worth it. The fourth moral: it's never too late to change. But change requires action, not words. Coulson didn't change because he said he was sorry. Words are easy. Words cost nothing. Coulson changed because he did the work. He left the comfort of his family's empire. He sat in a therapist's office and confronted the ugliest parts of himself. He showed up for his son, consistently, imperfectly, but relentlessly. Change is not a moment. It's not an apology. It's not a promise. Change is 1,000 small decisions made every single day to be better than you were yesterday. And it's never too late to start making those decisions. But you have to start. Today. The fifth moral: the best revenge is not revenge at all. It's living so well that your story speaks for itself. Nicole never went back to Coulson to rub her success in his face. She never called him to say, look at me now. She never posted about him. She never dragged his name through the mud. She didn't need to. Her life was the statement. Her company was the statement. Her son was the statement. Everything she built, every dollar, every award, every life changed by HomeLink, was louder than anything she could have ever said to Coulson Reed Whitfield. You don't need revenge. You don't need the last word. You just need to keep building, keep rising, keep living, and let your life do the talking. Nicole Carter never looked back. She just kept building. She kept loving. She kept rising. And if you're out there right now, struggling, doubting yourself, wondering if it's ever going to get better, wondering if the sacrifice is worth it, wondering if anyone sees how hard you're fighting, let Nicole's story remind you of something. You are not what happened to you. You are not the words someone spoke over you. You are not the rejection. You are not the abandonment. You are not the empty chair at the dinner table or the phone call that never came. You are what you choose to become. Now go out there and become something extraordinary.